Hello, everyone, and welcome to what will be the final reading and the ending of Best of H.P. Lovecraft, specifically the case of Charles Dexter Ward. As you can see, we're like so close. That's all that's left. These are all the pages that are left, so we're going to finish that up today. From that frightful smell and that uncanny noise, Willett's attention could no longer be diverted. Both were plainer and more hideous in the great pillared hall than anywhere else, and carried a vague impression of being far below, even in this dark netherworld of subterranean mystery. Before trying any of the black archways for steps leading further down, the doctor cast his beam of light about the stone-flagged floor. It was very loosely paved, and at irregular intervals there would occur a slab curiously pierced by small holes in no definite arrangement, while at one point there lay a very long ladder carelessly flung down. To this ladder, singularly enough, appeared to cling a particularly large amount of the frightful odor which encompassed everything. As he walked slowly about it, suddenly occurred to Willett that both the noise and the odor seemed strongest directly above the oddly pierced slabs, as if they might be crude trapdoors leading down still deeper to some region of horror. Kneeling by one, he worked at it with his hands and found that with extreme difficulty he could budge it. At his touch, the moaning beneath ascended to a louder key, and only with vast trepidation did he persevere in lifting of the heavy stone. A stench unnameable now rose up from below, and the doctor's head reeled dizzily as he laid back the slab and turned his torch upon the exposed square yard of gaping blackness. If he had expected a flight of steps to some wide gulf of ultimate abomination, Willett was destined to be disappointed. For amidst that fetor and cracked whining, he discerned only the brick-faced top of a cylindrical well, perhaps 1.5 yards in diameter and devoid of any ladder or other means of descent. As the light shone down, the wailing changed suddenly to a series of horrible yelps, in conjunction with which there came again that sound of blind, futile scrambling and slippery thumping. The explorer trembled, unwilling to even imagine what noxious thing might be lurking in that abyss, but in a moment he mustered up the courage to peer over the rough-hewn brink, lying at full length and holding the torch downward at arm's length to see what might lie below. For a second he could distinguish nothing but the slimy, moss-grown brick walls sinking illimitably into the half-tangible miasma of murk and foulness and anguished frenzy. And then he saw something dark was leaping clumsily and frantically up and down at the bottom of the narrow shaft, which must have been 20 to 25 feet below the stone floor where he lay. The torch shook in his hand, but he looked again to see what manner of living creature might be immured there in the darkness of that unnatural well, left starving by young Ward through all the long months since the doctors had taken him away, and clearly only one of a vast number prisoned in the kindred wells whose pierced stone covers so thickly studded the floor of the great vaulted cavern. Whatever the things were, they could not lie down in their cramped spaces, but must have crouched and whined and waited and feebly leaped all those hideous weeks since their master had abandoned them unheeded. But Marinus Bicknell Willett was sorry that he looked again. For surgeon and veteran of the dissecting room though he was, he has not been the same since. It is hard to explain just how a single sight of a tangible object with measurable dimensions could so shake and change a man, and we may only say that there is about certain outlines and entities a power of symbolism and suggestion which acts frightfully on a sensitive thinker's perspective and whispers terrible hints of obscure cosmic relationships and unnameable realities behind the protective illusions of common vision. In that second look, Willett saw such an outline or entity, for during the next few instants he was undoubtedly as stark mad as any inmate of Dr. Waite's private hospital. He dropped the electric torch from a hand drained of muscular power or nervous coordination, nor heeded the sound of crunching teeth which told of its fate at the bottom of the pit. He screamed and screamed and screamed in a voice whose falsetto panic no acquaintance of his world would ever have recognized, and though he could not rise to his feet, he crawled and rolled desperately away over the damp pavement where dozens of Tartarian wells poured forth their exhausted whining and yelping to answer his own insane cries. He tore his hands on the rough, loose stones, and many times bruised his head against the frequent pillars, but still he kept on. Then at last he slowly came to himself in the utter blackness and stench, and stopped his ears against the droning wail into which the bursts of yelping had subsided. He was drenched with perspiration and without means of producing a light, stricken and unnerved in the abysmal blackness and horror, crushed with a memory he could never efface. Beneath him, dozens of those things still lived, and from one of the shafts the cover was removed. He knew that what he had seen could never climb up the slippery walls, yet shuddered at the thought that some obscure foothold might exist. What the thing was, he would never tell. It was like some of the carvings on the hellish altar, but it was alive. Nature had never made it in this form, for it was too palpably unfinished. The deficiencies were of the most surprising sort, and the abnormalities of proportion could not be described. Willett consents only to say that this type of thing must have represented entities which Ward called up from imperfect salts, and which he kept for servile or ritualistic purposes. If it had not had a certain significance, its image would not have been carved on that damnable stone. It was not the worst thing depicted on that stone, but Willett never opened other pits. At the time, the first connected idea in his mind was an idle paragraph from some of the old Kerwin data he had digested long before, a phrase used by Simon or Jedediah Orne in that portentous confiscated letter to the bygone sorcerer. Certainly there was nothing but the liveliest awfulness in that which he raised up from what he could gather only a part of. Then, horribly supplementing rather than displacing this image, there came a recollection of these ancient lingering rumors anent the burnt and twisted things found in the fields a week after the Kerwin raid. Charles Ward had once told the doctor what old Slocum had said of that object, that it was neither thoroughly human nor wholly allied to any animal which Pawtucket folk had ever seen or read about. These words hummed in the doctor's mind as he rocked to and fro, squatting on the nitrous stone floor. He tried to drive them out and repeated the Lord's Prayer to himself, eventually trailing off into a mnemonic hodgepodge like the modernistic wasteland of Mr. T.S. Eliot, and finally reverting to the oft-repeated dual formula he had lately found in Ward's underground library. Yog-Sothoth, and so on, till the final underlined Zro. It seemed to soothe him, and he staggered to his feet after a time, lamenting bitterly his fright-lost torch, and looking wildly about for any gleam of light in the clutching inkiness of the chilly air. Think he would not, but he strained his eyes in every direction for some faint glint or reflection of the bright illumination he had left in the library. After a while, he thought he detected a suspicion of a glow infinitely far away, and toward this he crawled in agonized caution on hands and knees amidst the stench and howling, always feeling ahead lest he collide with the numerous great pillars or stumble into the abominable pit he had uncovered. Once his shaking fingers touched something which he knew must be the steps leading to the hellish altar, and from this spot he recoiled in loathing. At another time he encountered the pierced slab he had removed, and here his caution became almost pitiful. But he did not come upon the dread aperture at all, nor did anything issue from that aperture to detain him. What had been down there made no sound nor stir. Evidently its crunching of the fallen electric torch had not been good for it. Each time Willett's fingers felt a perforated slab, he trembled. His passage over it would sometimes increase the groaning below, but generally it would produce no effect at all, since he moved very noiselessly. Several times during his progress, the glow had diminished perceptibly, and he realized that the various candles and lamps he had left must be expiring one by one. The thought of being lost in utter darkness without matches amidst this underground world of nightmare labyrinths impelled him to rise to his feet and run, which he could safely do now that he had passed the open pit, for he knew that once the light failed, his only hope of rescue and survival would lie in whatever relief party Mr. Ward might send after missing him for a sufficient period. Presently, however, he emerged from the open space into the narrower corridor and definitely located the glow as coming from a door on his right. In a moment he had reached it and was standing once more in young Ward's secret library, trembling with relief and watching the sputterings of that last lamp which had brought him to safety. In another moment he was hastily filling the burned-out lamps from an oil supply he had previously noticed, and when the room was bright again, he looked about to see if he might find a lantern for further exploration. For racked though he was with horror, his sense of grim purpose was still uppermost, and he was firmly determined to leave no stone unturned in his search for the hideous facts behind Charles Ward's bizarre madness. Failing to find a lantern, he chose the smallest of lamps to carry, also filling his pockets with candles and matches, and taking with him a gallon of can oil, which he proposed to keep for reserve use in whatever hidden laboratory might uncover beyond the terrible open space with its unclean altar and nameless covered wells. To traverse that space again would require his utmost fortitude, but he knew that it must be done. Fortunately, neither the frightful altar nor the open shaft was near the vast cell-indented wall which bounded the cavern area, and whose black, mischievous archways would form the next jails of logical search. The next goals. I thought it was something. Sorry about that. So Willett went back to that great pillared hall of stench and anguished howling, turned down his lamps to avoid any distant glimpse of the hellish altar, or of the uncovered pit with the pierced stone slab beside it. Most of the doorways led merely to small chambers, some vacant and some evidently used as storerooms, and in several of the latter he saw some very curious accumulations of various objects. One was packed with rotting and dust-draped bales of spare clothing, and the explorer thrilled when he saw that it was unmistakably the clothing of a century and a half before. In another room, he found numerous odds and ends of modern clothing, as if gradual provisions were being made to equip a large body of men. But what he disliked most of all were the huge copper vats which occasionally appeared. These, and the sinister incrustations upon them. He liked them even less than the weirdly figured leaden bowls whose ruins retained such obnoxious deposits around which clung repellent odors perceptible above even the general noisomeness of the crypt. When he had completed about half the entire circuit of the wall, he found another corridor like that from which he had come, and out of which many doors opened. He proceeded to investigate, and after entering 3 rooms of medium size and of no significant contents, he came at last to a large oblong apartment whose business-like tanks and tables, furnaces and modern instruments, occasional books and endless shelves of jars and bottles proclaimed it indeed the long-sought laboratory of Charles Ward, and no doubt of old Joseph Curwen before him. After lighting the 3 lamps which he found filled and ready, Dr. Willett examined the place and all its appurtenances with the keenest interest. Nothing from the relative quantities of various reagents on the shelves that young Ward's dominant concern must have been with some branch of organic chemistry. On the whole, little could be learned from the scientific ensemble, which included a gruesome-looking dissecting table, so that the room was really rather a disappointment. Among the books was a tattered old copy of Borellus in black letter, and it was weirdly interesting to note that Ward had underlined the same passage whose marking had so perturbed good Mr. Merritt at Curwen's farmhouse more than a century and a half before. That older copy, of course, must have perished along with the rest of Curwen's occult library in the final raid. 3 archways opened off the laboratory, and these the doctor proceeded to sample in turn. From his cursory survey, he saw that 2 led merely to small storerooms, but these he canvassed with care, remarking the piles of coffins in various stages of damage and shuddering violently at 2 or 3 of the few coffin plates he could decipher. There was much clothing also stored in these rooms, and several new and tightly nailed boxes which he did not stop to investigate. Most interesting of all, perhaps, were some odd bits which he judged to be fragments of old Joseph Curwen's laboratory appliances. These had suffered damage at the hands of the raiders, but were still partly recognizable as the chemical paraphernalia of the Georgian period. The 3rd archway led to a very sizable chamber entirely lined with shelves, and having in the center a table bearing 2 lamps. These lamps Willett lighted, and in their brilliant glow studied the endless shelving which surrounded him. Some of the upper levels were wholly vacant, but most of the space was filled with small, odd-looking leaden jars of 2 general types. One tall and without handles like the Grecian lekithos or oil jug, and the other with a single handle and proportioned like a Phaleron jug. All had metal stoppers and were covered with peculiar-looking symbols molded in low relief. In a moment, the doctor noticed that these jugs were classified with great rigidity, all the lekithoi being on one side of the room, with a large wooden sign reading "Custodes" above them, and all the Phalerons on the other, correspondingly labeled with the sign reading "Materia." Each of these jars, or jugs, except some on the upper shelves that turned out to be vacant, bore a cardboard tag with a number apparently referring to a catalog, and Willett resolved to look for the latter presently. For a moment, however, he was more interested in the nature of the array as a whole, and experimentally opened several of the Lekythoi and Phalerons at random with a view to a rough generalization. The result was invariable. Both types of jars contained a small quantity of a single kind of substance, a fine dusty powder of very light weight and many shades of dull neutral color. To the colors which formed the only point of variation, there was no apparent method of disposal, and no distinction between what occurred in the Lekythoi and what occurred in the Phalerons. A bluish-gray powder might be by the side of a pinkish-white one, and any one in a Phaleron might have its exact counterpart in a Lekythos. The most individual feature about the powders was their non-adhesiveness. Willett would pour one into his hand upon returning it to its jug, would find that no residue whatsoever remained on his palm. The meaning of the two signs puzzled him, and he wondered why this battery of chemicals was separated so radically from those in glass jars on the shelves of the laboratory proper. Custodes, materia. That was the Latin for guards and material, respectively. And then there came a flash of memory as to where he had seen the word guards before in connection with the dreadful mystery. It was, of course, in the recent letter to Dr. Allen, purporting to be from old Edward Hutchinson, and the phrase read, "There was no need to keep the guards in shape and eating off their heads, and it was made to be much to be found in the case of trouble, as you too well know." What did this signify? But wait, was there still not another reference to the guards in this matter, which he had failed to wholly recall when reading the Hutchinson letters? Back in the old non-secretive days, Ward had told him of Eleazar Smith's diary recording the spying of Smith and Whedon on the Kerwin farm in that dreadful chronicle. There had been mention of conversations overheard before the old wizard betook himself wholly beneath the earth. There had been, Smith and Whedon insisted, terrible colloquies wherein figured Kerwin, certain captives his, and guards of those captives. Those guards, according to Hutchinson or his avatar, had eaten their heads off, so that now Dr. Allen did not keep them in shape. And if not in shape, how save as the salts to which appear in this wizard band was engaged in reducing as many human bodies or skeletons as they could? So that is what these Lekythor contained, the monstrous fruit of unhallowed rites and deeds, presumably won or cowed to such submission as to help when called up by some hellish incantation in the defense of their blasphemous master, or the questioning of those who were not so willing. Willett shuddered at the thought of what he had been pouring in and out of his hands, and for a moment felt an impulse to flee in panic from that cavern of hideous shelves with their silent and perhaps watching sentinels. Then he thought of the materia, and the myriad Phaleron jugs on the other side of the room. Salts, too, and if not the salts of guards, then the salts of what? God, could it be possible that here lay the mortal relics of half the Titan thinkers of all the ages, snatched by supreme ghouls from crypts where the world thought them to be safe and subject to the beck and call of madmen who sought to drain their knowledge for some still wilder end, whose ultimate effect would concern, as poor Charles had hinted in his frantic note, all civilization, all natural law, perhaps even the fate of the solar system and universe? And Marinus Bicknell Willett had sifted their dust through his hands. Then he noticed a small door on the farther end of the room, and calmed himself enough to approach it, and examine the crude signs chiseled above. It was only a symbol, but it filled him with vague spiritual dread, for a morbid, dreaming friend of his had once drawn it on paper and told him of the few things it means in the dark abyss of sleep. It was the sign of Koth, that dreamers see fixed above the archways of certain black towers standing alone in the twilight. And Willett did not like what his friend Randolph Carter had said of its power. But a moment later he forgot the sign as he recognized a new acrid odor in the stench-filled air. This was a chemical rather than animal smell and came clearly from the room beyond the door. And it was, unmistakably, the same odor which had saturated Charles Ward's clothing on the day the doctors had taken him away. So it was here the youth had been interrupted by the final summons? He was wiser than old Joseph Kerwin, for he had not resisted. Willett, boldly determined to penetrate every wonder and nightmare this netherrealm might contain, seized the small lamp and crossed the threshold. A wave of nameless fright rolled out to meet him, but he yielded to no whim and deferred to no intuition. There was nothing alive here to harm him, and he would not be stayed in his piercings of the eldritch cloud which engulfed his patient. The room beyond the door was of medium size and had no furniture save a table, a single chair, and two groups of curious machines with clamps and wheels, which Willett recognized after a moment as medieval instruments of torture. On one side of the door stood a rack of savage whips, above which there were some shelves bearing empty rows of shallow pedestaled cups of lead shaped like Grecian kylikes. I don't know what that means. On the other side was the table, with a powerful argand lamp, a pad and a pencil, and two of the stoppered lekythoi from the shelves outside set down at irregular places, as if temporarily or in haste. Willett lighted the lamp and looked carefully at the pad to see what notes young Ward might have been jotting down when interrupted, but found nothing more intelligible than the following disjointed fragments that crabbed Kerwin chirography, which shed no light on the case as a whole. Bodied not, escaped into walls and found place below. Saw old V say ye Sabbath and learnt your way. Raised Yog-Sothoth thrice, and the next day delivered. F sought to wipe out all knowing how to raise those from outside. Not really that helpful at all, actually. As the strong argand blaze lit up the entire chamber, the doctor saw that the wall opposite the door, between the two groups of torturing appliances in the corners, was covered with pegs from which hung a set of shapeless-looking robes and of rather dismal yellowish white. But far more interesting were the two vacant walls, both of which were thickly covered with mystic symbols and formula roughly chiseled in the smooth dressed stone. The damp floor also bore marks of carving, but with little difficulty. Willett deciphered a huge pentagram in the center, with a plain circle about 3 feet wide halfway through this in each corner. In one of these 4 circles, near the yellowish robe, where a yellowish robe had been flung carelessly down, there stood a shallow kylix of the sort found on the shelves above the whip rack. Just outside the periphery was one of the Falaran jugs from the shelves in the other room. It's tag numbered 118. This was unstoppered and proved upon inspection to be empty, but the explorer saw with a shiver that the kylix was not. Within its shallow area, and saved from scattering only by the absence of wind in this sequestered cavern, lay a small amount of a dry, dullish green efflorescent powder, which must have belonged in the jug. And Willett almost reeled at the implication that came sweeping over him as he correlated little by little the several elements and the antecedents of the scene. The whips and the instruments of torture, the dust or salts from the jug of materia, the two lekythoi from the custode shelves, the robes, the formula on the walls, the notes on the pads, the hints from the letters and legends, and the thousand glimpses, doubts, and suppositions which had come to torment the friends and parents of Charles Ward, all these engulfed the doctor in a tidal wave of horror as he looked at that dry greenish powder outspread in the pedestal leaden kylix on the floor. With an effort, however, Willett pulled himself together and began studying the formula chiseled on the walls. From the stained and encrusted letters, it was obvious that they were carved in Joseph Kerwin's time, and their text was such to be vaguely familiar to one who had read much of Kerwin material or delved extensively into the history of magic. One the doctor clearly recognized was what Miss Ward had heard her son chanting on that noxious Good Friday a year before, and what an authority had told him was a very terrible invocation addressed to secret gods outside the normal spheres. It was not spelled here exactly as Miss Ward had set it down from memory, nor as yet the authority had shown it to him on the forbidden pages of Eliphas Levi, but its identity was unmistakable, and such words as Sabaoth, Metraton, Almonson, and Zariatnamic sent a shudder of fright through the researcher who had seen and felt so much of the cosmic abomination just around the corner. This was on the left-hand wall as one entered the room. The right-hand wall was no less thickly inscribed, and Willett felt a start of recognition as he came upon the pair of formula so frequently occurring in the recent notes in the library. They were, roughly speaking, the same, with the ancient symbols of dragon's head and dragon's tail heading them as in Ward's scribblings, but the spelling differed quite widely from that of modern versions, as if old Kerwin had a different way of recording sound, or as if a later study had evolved more powerful and perfected variants of the invocations in question. The doctor tried to reconcile the chiseled version with the one that still ran persistently in his head, and found it hard to do so. Where the script he had memorized began with Yai Nagai Yog Stathoth, This epigraph started out as I Sengenga Yog Sothotha, which to his mind would seriously interfere with the syllabification of the second word. Ground as the later text was into his consciousness, the discrepancy disturbed him as he found himself chanting the first of the formula aloud in an effort to square the sound he conceived with the letters he found carved. Weird and menacing in that abyss of antique blasphemy rang his voice, its accents keyed to a droning sing-song, either through the spell of the past and the unknown, or through the hellish example of that dull, godless wail from the pits, whose inhuman coldness rose and fell rhythmically in the distance through the stench of the darkness. Yanga Yog Sothoth he Ligveg Fi Throdog however you say that. But what was this cold wind which had sprung into life at the very outset of the chant? The lamps were sputtering woefully, and the gloom grew so dense that the letters on the wall nearly faded from sight. There was smoke, too, and an acrid odor which quite drowned out the stench from the faraway wells. An odor like that he had smelt before, yet infinitely stronger and more pungent. He turned the inscriptions to face the room with its bizarre contents, and saw that the kylix on the floor, in which the ominous efflorescence powder had lain, was giving forth a cloud of thick, greenish-black vapor of surprising volume and opacity. That powder, great God! It had come from the shelf of materia. What was it doing now, and what had started it? I don't know, that incantation you just said? The formula he had been chanting, the first of the pair, Dragon's Head, Ascending Node, blessed Savior, could it be? The doctor reeled, and through his head raced wildly disjointed scraps from what all he had seen and read of this frightful case of Joseph Kerwin and Charles Dexter Ward. I say to you again, do not call up any that you cannot put down. Have ye words for laying at all times ready, and stop not to be sure when there is any doubt of whom you have. 3 talks with what, and therein inhumed. Mercy of heaven, what is that shape behind the parting smoke? Marinus Bicknell Willett has no hope that any part of his tale will be believed except by certain sympathetic friends. Hence he has made no attempt to tell it beyond his most intimate circle. Only a few outsiders have ever heard it repeated, and of those majority laugh and remark that the doctor is surely getting old. He has been advised to take a long vacation to shun future cases dealing with mental disturbances, but Mr. Ward knows that the veteran physician speaks only a horrible truth. Did not he himself see the noisome aperture in the bungalow cellar? Did not Willett send him home, overcome at 11 o'clock that portentous morning? Did he not telephone the doctor in vain that evening, and again the next day? And had he not driven to the bungalow itself on that following noon, finding his friend unconscious but unharmed on one of the beds upstairs? Willett had been breathing stertorously, and opened his eyes slowly when Mr. Ward gave him some brandy fetched from the car. Then he shuddered and screamed, crying out, "That beard! Those eyes! God, who are you?" A very strange thing to say to a trim, blue-eyed, clean-shaven gentleman whom he had known for the latter's boyhood. In the bright noon sunlight, the bungalow was unchanged since the previous morning. Willett's clothing bore no disarrangement beyond certain smudges and worn places at the knees, and only a faint acrid odor reminded Mr. Ward of what he had smelt on his son the day he was taken to the hospital. The doctor's flashlight was missing, but his valise was safely there, as empty as when he had brought it. Before indulging in any explanations, and obviously with great moral effort, Willett staggered dizzily down to the cellar and tried the fateful platform before the tubs. It was unyielding. Crossing to where he had left his unused tool satchel the day before, he obtained a chisel and began to pry up the stubborn planks one by one. Underneath, the smooth concrete was still visible, but any of the openings of perforation there was no longer a trace. Nothing yawned this time to sicken the mystified father who had followed the doctor downstairs, only the smooth concrete underneath the planks. No noisome well, no world of subterranean horrors, no secret library, no Kerwin papers, no nightmare pits of stench and howling, no laboratory or shelves or chiseled formula, no. Dr. Willett turned pale and clutched at the younger man. "Yesterday," he said softly, "did you see it here and smell it?" And Mr. Ward, himself transfixed with dread and wonder, found strength to nod in affirmative. The physician gave a sound half sigh and half a gasp, and nodded in turn. "Then I will tell you," he said. So for an hour, in the sunniest room they could find upstairs, the physician whispered his frightful tale to the wondering father. There was nothing to relate beyond the looming up of the form when the greenish-black vapor from the kylix parted, and Willett was too tired to ask himself what had really occurred. There were futile, bewildered head-shakings from both men, and once Mr. Ward ventured a hushed suggestion. "Do you suppose it would be of any use to dig?" The doctor was silent, for it seemed hardly fitting for any human brain to answer when powers of unknown spheres had so vitally encroached on this side of the great abyss. Again, Mr. Ward asked, "But where did it go? It brought you here, and it sealed up the hole somehow." And Willett again let silence answer for him. But after all, this was not the final phase of the matter. Reaching for his handkerchief before rising to leave, Dr. Willett's fingers closed upon a piece of paper in his pocket which had not been there before, and which was companioned by the candles and matches he had seized in the vanished vault. It was a common sheet, torn obviously from the cheap pad in the fabulous room of horror somewhere underground, and the writing upon it was that of an ordinary lead pencil, doubtless the one which had lain beside the pad. It was folded very carelessly, and beyond the faint acrid scent of the cryptic chamber, bore no print or mark of any world but this. But the text itself did indeed reek with wonder, for there was no script of any wholesome age, but the labored strokes of medieval darkness, scarcely legible to the layman who now strained over it, yet having combinations of symbols which seemed vaguely familiar. The briefly scrawled message was this, and its mystery lent purpose to the shaken pair, who forthwith walked steadily out to the ward car and gave orders to be driven first to a quiet dining place and then to the John Hay Library on the hill. Okay, well, that's what the words look like. They're not really in English, but I think it explains it in a minute. At the library, it was easy to find good manuals of paleography, and over these, the two men puzzled till the lights of the evening shone out from the great chandelier. In the end, they found what was needed. The letters were indeed no fantastic invention, but the normal script of a very dark period. They were pointed to the Saxon minuscules of the 8th or 9th century AD, and brought with them the memories of an uncouth time when, under a fresh Christian veneer, ancient faiths and ancient rites stirred stealthily, and the pale moon of Britain looked sometimes on strange deeds in the Roman ruins of Carleon and Hexhas, and by the towers along the Hadrian's crumbling wall. The words were in such Latin as a barbarous age might remember: Corvinus necandis est, cadaver aqua dissolvendum, nec aliquid retenendum, tasse ut potes, which may roughly be translated, Kerwin must be killed, the body must be dissolved in aqua fortis, nor must anything be retained. Keep silence as best as you are able. Willett and Mr. Ward were mute and baffled. They had met the unknown and found that they lacked emotions to respond to it as they vaguely believed they ought. With Willett, especially the capacity for receiving fresh impressions of awe was well nigh exhausted for both men, sat still and helpless till the closing of the library forced them to leave. And then they drove listlessly to the Ward mansion in Prospect Street and talked to no purpose into the night. The doctor rested towards morning, but did not go home. And he was still there Sunday noon when a telephone message came from the detectives who had been assigned to look up Dr. Allen. Mr. Ward, who was pacing nervously about in a dressing gown, answered the call in person and told the men to come up early the next day when he heard the report was almost ready. Both Willett and he were glad that this phase of the matter was taking form. For whatever the origin of the strange minuscule message, it seemed certain that the Kerwin who must be destroyed could be no other than the bearded and spectacled stranger. Charles had feared this man and said that the frantic note he must be killed and dissolved in acid. Allen, moreover, had been receiving letters from the strange wizards in Europe under the name of Kerwin, and palpably regarded himself as an avatar of the bygone necromancer. And now a fresh and unknown source had come in saying that Kerwin must be killed and dissolved in acid. The linkage was too unmistakable to be fictitious, and besides, was not Allen planning to murder young Ward upon the advice of the creature called Hutchinson? Of course, the letter they had seen had never reached the bearded stranger, but from its text they could see that Allen had already formed plans for dealing with the youth if he grew too squeamish. Without doubt, Allen must be apprehended, and even if the most drastic directions were not carried out, he must be placed where he can inflict no harm upon Charles Ward. That afternoon, hoping against hope to extract some gleam of information amid the inmost mysteries from the only available and one capable of giving it, the father and doctor went down to the bay and called on young Charles at the hospital. Simply and gravely, Willett told him all he had found, and notice how pale he turned as each description made certain of the truth of the discovery. The physician employed as much dramatic effect as he could, and watching for a wincing on Charles's part when he approached the matter of the covered pits and the nameless hybrids within. But Ward did not wince. Willett paused, and his voice grew indignant as he spoke of how the things were starving. He taxed the youth with shocking inhumanity, and shivered when only a sardonic laugh came in reply. For Charles, having dropped his pretense that crypt didn't exist, seemed to see some ghastly jest in this affair, and chuckled hoarsely at something which amused him. Then he whispered, in accents doubly terrible because of the cracked voice he used, "Damn 'em, they do eat, but they don't need to. That's the rare part. A month, you say, without food? Lord, sir, you be modest. Do you know that was a joke on poor old Whipple with his virtuous bluster? Killed everything off, would he? Why, damn, he was half deaf with the noise from the outside. Never saw or heard aught from the wells. He never dreamed they were down there at all. Devil take ye, these cursed things have been howling down there ever since Curwen was done, for 157 years gone." But no more than this could Willett get from the youth. Horrified, yet almost convinced against his will, he went on with his tale in the hope that some incident might startle his auditor out of the mad composure he maintained. Looking at the youth's face, the doctor could not but feel a kind of terror at the changes which recent months had wrought. Truly, the boy had drawn down nameless horrors from the skies. When the room with the formula and greenish dust was mentioned, Charles showed his first sign of animation. A quizzical look overspread his face as he heard what Willett had read on the pad, and he ventured the mild statement that those notes were old ones, of no possible significance to anyone not deeply initiated in the history of magic. "But," he added, "had you but known the words to bring up that which I had out in the cup, you would not have been here to tell me this. 'Twas number 118, and I conceive you that you would have shook had you looked up the other list in the room. 'Twas never raised by me, but I meant to have it up that day when you came to invite me hither." Then Willett told of the formula he had spoken, and of the greenish-black smoke which had arisen, and as he did so, he saw true fear dawn for the first time on Charles Ward's face. "It came, and you be here alive!" As Ward croaked these words, his voice seemed almost to burst free of its trammels and sink to the cavernous abysses of uncanny resonance. Willett, gifted with a flash of inspiration, believed he saw the situation, and wove into his reply a caution from a letter he remembered. "Number 118, you say? But don't forget that stones are all changed now, and 9 grounds out of 10. You're never sure till you question." And then, without warning, he drew forth the minuscule message and flashed it before the patient's eyes. He could have wished no stronger result, for Charles Ward fainted forthwith. All this conversation, of course, had been conducted with the greatest secrecy, lest the resident alienist accuse the father and physician of encouraging a madman in his delusions. Unaided, too, Dr. Willett and Mr. Ward picked up the stricken youth, placed him on the couch. In reviving, the patient mumbled many times of some word which he must get to Orne and Hutchinson at once. So when his consciousness seemed fully back, the doctor told him of those strange creatures, at least one was his bitter enemy, and had given Dr. Allen advice for his assassination. This revelation produced no visible effect, and before it was made, the visitors could see their host had already had the look of a hunted man. After that, he would converse no more, so Willett and the father departed presently, leaving behind a caution against the bearded Allen, to which the youth only replied that this individual was very safely taken care of, and could do no one any harm even if he wished. This was said with an almost evil chuckle, very painful to hear. They did not worry about any communications Charles might write to that monstrous pair in Europe, since they knew the hospital authorities seized all outgoing mail for censorship and would pass no wild or outer-looking missive. There is, however, a curious sequel to the matter of Orne and Hutchinson. If such, indeed, the exile wizards were. Moved by some vague presentiment amidst the horrors of that period, Willett arranged with an international press-cutting bureau for accounts of notable current crimes and accidents in Prague and in eastern Transylvania, and after 6 months believed that he had found two very significant things amongst the multifarious items he received and had translated. One was the total wrecking of a house by night in the oldest quarter of Prague, and the disappearance of the evil old man called Joseph Nade, who had dwelt in it alone ever since anyone could remember. The other was a titan explosion in the Transylvanian mountains east of the Rakus, and utter extirpation with all its inmates of the ill-regarded castle Ferenczi, whose master was so badly spoken of by peasants and soldiery alike that he would shortly have been summoned to Bucharest for serious questioning had not this incident cut off a career so long as to antedate all common memory. Willett maintains that the hand which wrote those minuscules was able to wield stronger weapons as well, and that while Kerwin was left to him to dispose of, the writer felt able to find a deal with Orne and Hutchinson himself. Of what their fate may have been, the doctor strives sedulously not to think. The following morning, Dr. Willett hastened to the ward home to be present when the detectives arrived. Alan's destruction or imprisonment, or Kerwin's if one might regard the tacit claim to reincarnation as valid, he felt must be accomplished at any cost, and he communicated this conviction to Mr. Ward as they sat waiting for the men to come. They were downstairs for this time, for the upper parts of the house were beginning to be shunned because of a peculiar nauseousness which hung indefinitely about, a nauseousness which the older servants connected with some curse left by the vanished Kerwin portrait. At 9 o'clock, the three detectives presented themselves and immediately delivered all that they had to say. They had not, regrettably enough, located the brava Tony Gomez as had wished, nor had they found the least trace of Dr. Allen's source or present whereabouts. But they had managed to unearth a considerable number of local impressions and facts concerning the reticent stranger. Allen had struck Pawtucket people as a vaguely unnatural being, and there was a universal belief that his thick sandy beard was either dyed or false, a belief conclusively upheld by the finding of such false beard, together with a pair of dark glasses, in his room at the fateful bungalow. His voice, Mr. Ward here could testify from his one telephone conversation, had a depth and a hollowness that could not be forgotten, and his glance seemed malign even through his smoked and horn-rimmed glasses. One shopkeeper, in the course of negotiation, had seen a specimen of his handwriting, declaring it was very queer and crabbed, this being confirmed by penciled notes of no clear meaning found in his room and identified by the merchant. In connection with the vampirism ructions of the previous summer, a majority of the gossips believed that Allen, rather than Ward, was the actual vampire. Statements were also obtained from the officials who had visited the bungalow after the unpleasant incident of the motor truck robbery. They had felt less of the sinister in Dr. Allen, but had recognized him as the dominant figure in the queer, shadowy cottage. The place had been too dark for them to observe him clearly, but they would know him if they saw him again. His beard had looked odd, and they thought he had some slight scar above his dark spectacled right eye. As for the search of Allen's room, it yielded nothing definite save the beard and glasses, and several penciled notes in a crabbed writing, which Willett at once saw was identical with that shared by the old Kerwin manuscripts, and by the voluminous recent notes of young Ward found in the vanished catacombs of the horror. Dr. Willett and Mr. Ward caught something of a profound, subtle, and insidious cosmic fear from these data as they gradually unfolded, and almost trembled in following up the vague, mad thought which had simultaneously reached their minds. The false beard and glasses, the crabbed Kerwin penmanship, the old portrait and its tiny scar, and the altered youth in the hospital with such a scar. That deep, hollow voice on the telephone. Was it not of this that Mr. Ward was reminded when his son barked forth those pitiable notes to which he now claimed to be reduced? Who had ever seen Charles and Allen together? Yes, the officials had once, but who later on? Was it not when Allen left that Charles suddenly lost his growing fright and began to live wholly at the bungalow? Kerwin, Allen, Ward, in what blasphemous and abominable fusion had two ages of the persons become involved? That damnable resemblance to the picture of Charles, had it not used to stare and follow the boy around the room with its eyes? Why, too, did both Allen and Charles copy Joseph Kerwin's handwriting, even when alone and off guard? And then the frightful work of those people, the lost crypt of horrors that had aged the doctor overnight, The starved monsters in the noisome pits, the awful formula which had yielded such nameless results, the message in minuscules found in Willett's pockets, the papers and letters, and all the talk of graves and salts and discoveries. Whither did everything lead? In the end, Mr. Ward did the most sensible thing. Steeling himself against any realization of why he did it, he gave the detectives an article to be shown to such Pawtucket shopkeepers as had seen the portentous Dr. Allen. That article was a photograph of his luckless son, on which he carefully drew in ink the pair of heavy glasses and the black-pointed beard, which the man had brought from Allen's room. For 2 hours he waited with the doctor in the oppressive house where fear and miasma were slowly gathering as the empty panel in the upstairs library leered and leered and leered. Then the men returned. Yes, the altered photograph was a very passable likeness of Dr. Allen. Mr. Ward turned pale, and Willett wiped a suddenly dampened brow with his handkerchief. Allen, Ward, Kerwin. It was becoming too hideous for coherent thought. What had the boy called out of the void, and what had it done to him? What really happened to him from first to last? Who was this Allen who sought to kill Charles as too squeamish? And why had his destined victim said in the postscript to that frantic letter that he must be so completely obliterated in acid? Why, too, had the minuscule message, of whose origin no one dared think, say that Kerwin must be likewise obliterated? What was the change, and when had the final stage occurred? That day, when his frantic note was received, he had been nervous all the morning, and then there was the alteration. He had slipped out unseen and swaggered boldly in past the men hired to guard him. That was the time when he was out. But no, had he not cried out in terror as he entered his study to this very room? What had he found there? Oh, wait, what had found him? That simulacrum which brushed boldly in without having been seen to go. Was that an alien shadow and horror forcing itself upon a trembling figure which had never gone out at all? Had not the butler spoken of queer noises? Willett rang for the man and asked him some low-toned questions. It had, surely enough, been a bad business. There had been noises, a cry, a gasp, a choking, and a sort of clattering or creaking or thumping, or all of these. And Mr. Charles was not the same when he walked out without a word. The butler shivered as he spoke and sniffed the heavy air that blew down from some open window upstairs. Terror had settled definitely upon the house, and only the businesslike detectives failed to imbibe a full measure of it. Even they were restless, for this case had held vague elements in the background which pleased them not at all. Dr. Willett was thinking deeply and rapidly, and his thoughts were terrible ones. Now and then he would almost break into mutterings as he ran over in his head a new, appalling, and increasingly conclusive chain of nightmare happenings. Then Mr. Ward made a sign that the conference was over, and everyone save him and the doctor left the room. It was noon now, but shadows as of coming night seemed to engulf the phantom-haunted mansion. Willett began talking very seriously to his host, and urged that he leave a great deal of the future investigation to him. There would be, he predicted, certain obnoxious elements which a friend could bear better than a relative. As family physician, he must have a free hand, and the first thing he required was a period alone and undisturbed in the abandoned library upstairs, where the ancient overmantel had gathered about itself an aura of noisome horror more intense than when Joseph Kerwin's features themselves glanced slyly down from the painted panel. Mr. Ward, dazed by a flood of grotesque morbidities and unthinkably maddening suggestions that poured in upon him from every side, could only acquiesce, and half an hour later the doctor was locked in the shunned room with the paneling from the Olney court. The father, listening outside, heard fumbling sounds of moving, rummaging, as the moments passed, and finally a wrench and a creak, as if a tight cupboard door was being opened. Then there was a muffled cry, a kind of snorting choke, and a hasty slamming of whatever had been opened. Almost at once the key rattled, and Willett appeared in the hall, haggard and ghastly, and demanding wood for the real fireplace on the south wall of the room. The furnace was not enough, he said, and the electric log had little practical use. Longing yet not daring to ask questions, Mr. Ward gave the requisite orders, and a man brought some stout pine logs, shuddering as he entered the tainted air of the library to place them in the grate. Willett, meanwhile, had gone up to the dismantled laboratory and brought down a few odds and ends not included in the moving of the July before. They were in a covered basket, and Mr. Ward never saw what they were. Then the doctor locked himself in the library once more, and by the clouds of smoke which rolled down past the windows from the chimney, it was known that he had lighted the fire. Later, after a great rustling of newspaper, that odd wrench and creaking were heard again, followed by a thumping, which none of the eavesdroppers liked. Thereafter, 2 suppressed cries of Willett's were heard, and hard upon these came a swishing rustle of indefinable hatefulness. Finally, the smoke that the wind beat down from the chimney grew very dark and acrid, and everyone wished that the weather had spared them this choking and venomous inundation of peculiar fumes. Mr. Ward's head reeled, and the servants all clustered together in a knot to watch the horrible black smoke swoop down. After an age of waiting, the vapor seemed to lighten, and half-formless sounds of scraping, sweeping, and other minor operations were heard behind the bolted door. And at last, after slamming of some cupboard within, Willett made his appearance, sad, pale, and haggard, and bearing the cloth-draped basket he had taken from the upstairs laboratory. He had left the window open, and into that once accursed room was pouring a wealth of pure, wholesome air to mix with a queer new smell of disinfectants. The ancient overmantel still lingered, but it seemed robbed of malignity now, and rose as calmly and stately in its white paneling as if it had never borne the picture of Joseph Curwen. Night was coming on, yet this time its shadows held no latent fright, but only a gentle melancholy. Of what he had done the doctor would never speak. To Mr. Ward he said, "I can answer no questions, but I will say that there are different kinds of magic. I have made a great purgation. Those in this house will sleep the better for it." That Dr. Willett's purgation had been an order almost as nerve-wracking in its way as his hideous wandering in the vanished crypt is shown by the fact that the elderly physician gave out completely as soon as he reached home that evening. For 3 days he rested constantly in his room, though servants later muttered there was something about having heard him after midnight on Wednesday, when the outer door opened softly and closed with phenomenal softness. Servants' imaginations, fortunately, are limited, else comment might have been excited in an item in Thursday's Evening Bulletin, which ran as follows. After a lull of 10 months since the dastardly vandalism in the Whedon lot at North Burial Ground, a nocturnal prowler was glimpsed early this morning in the same cemetery by Robert Hart, the night watchman. Happened to glance for a moment from his shelter about 2 a.m. Hart observed the glow of a lantern or pocket torch not far to the northward, and upon opening the door detected the figure of a man with a trowel very plainly silhouetted against a nearby electric light. At once starting in pursuit, he saw the figure dart hurriedly towards the main entrance, gaining the street and losing himself among the shadows before approach or capture was possible. Like the first of the ghouls active during the past year, this intruder had done no real damage before detection. A vacant part of the ward lot showed signs of little superficial digging, but nothing even nearly the size of gravel had been attempted, and no previous grave had been disturbed. Hart, who cannot describe the prowler except as a small man probably having a full beard, inclines to the view that all 3 of the digging incidents have a common source. But police from the second station think otherwise on account of the savage nature of the second incident, where the ancient coffin was removed and its headstone violently shattered. The first of the incidents, in which it is thought an attempt to bury something was frustrated, occurred a year ago, last March, and has been attributed to bootleggers seeking a cache. It is possible, says Sergeant Riley, that this third affair is of similar nature. Officers at the second station are taking especial pains to capture the gang of miscreants responsible for these repeated outrages. All day Thursday, Dr. Willett rested as if recuperating from something past or nerving himself for something to come. In the evening, he wrote a note to Mr. Ward, which was delivered the next morning, which caused the half-day's parent to ponder longly and deeply. Mr. Ward had not been able to go down to business since the shock of Monday with its baffling reports and its sinister purgation, but he found something calming about the doctor's letter in spite of the despair it seemed to promise and the fresh mysteries it seemed to evoke. Dear Theodore, I feel I must say a word with you before what I am going to do tomorrow. It will conclude the terrible business we have been going through, for I feel that no spade is ever likely to reach that monstrous place we know of, but I'm afraid it won't set your mind at rest until I can expressly assure you how conclusive it is. You have known me ever since you were a small boy, so I think you will not distrust me when I hint that some matters are best left undecided and unexplored. It is better that you attempt no further speculations as to Charles's case, and almost imperative that you tell his mother nothing more than she already suspects. When I call on you tomorrow, Charles will have escaped. That is all which need remains in anyone's mind. He was mad, and he escaped. You can tell his mother gently and gradually about the mad part when you stop sending the typed notes in his name. I'd advise you to join her in Atlantic City and take a rest yourself. God knows you need one after this shock, as I do myself. I am going south for a while to calm down and brace up. So don't ask me any questions when I call. It may be that something will go wrong, but I'll tell you if it does. I don't think it will. There will be nothing more to worry about, for Charles will be very, very safe. He is now safer than you dream. You need hold no fears about Alan and who or what he is. He forms as much a part of the past Joseph Kerwin's picture, and when I ring your doorbell, you may feel certain that there is no such person. And what wrote that minuscule message will never trouble you or yours. But you must steel yourself to melancholy and prepare your wife to do the same. I must tell you frankly that Charles's escape will not mean his restoration to you. He has been afflicted with a peculiar disease, as you must realize from the subtle physical as well as mental changes in him, and you must not hope to see him again. Have only this consolation. He was never a fiend or even truly a madman, but only an eager, studious, and curious boy whose love of mystery in the past was his undoing. He stumbled on things no mortal ought to ever know, and reached back through years as no one should ever reach, and something came out of those years to engulf him. And now comes the matter in which I must ask you to trust me most of all, for there will be no uncertainty about Charles's fate. In about a year, say, you can find a suitable account of the end of the boy will be no more. You can put up a stone in your lot at the North Burial Ground exactly 10 feet west of your father's and facing the same way. And that will mark the true resting place of your son. Nor need you fear that it will mark any abnormality or changeling. The ashes in that grave will be those of your unaltered bone and sinew, of the real Charles Dexter Ward, whose mind you watched from infancy. The real Charles with the olive mark on his hip, without the black witch mark on his chest, or the pit on his forehead. The Charles who never did actual evil, and will have paid with his life for his squeamishness. That is all. Charles will have escaped, and a year from now you can put up his stone. Do not question me tomorrow, and believe that the honor of your ancient family remains untainted now, as it has been for all times in the past. With profoundest sympathy and exhortations of fortitude, calmness, and resignation, I am ever sincerely your friend, Marinus B. Willett. So on the morning of Friday, April 13th, 1928, Marinus Bicknell Willett visited the room of Charles Dexter Ward at Dr. Waite's private hospital on Conanicut Island. The youth, though making no attempt to evade his caller, was in a sullen mood and seemed disinclined to open conversation, which Willett obviously desired. The doctor's discovery of the crypt and his monstrous experience therein had, of course, created a new source of embarrassment, so that both hesitated perceptibly after the exchange of a few strained formalities. Then a new element of constraint crept in, as Ward seemed to read behind the doctor's mask-like face a terrible purpose which had never been there before. The patient quailed, conscious that, since the last visit, there had been a change whereby the solicitous family physician had given place to the ruthless, implacable avenger. Ward actually turned pale, and the doctor was first to speak. More, he said, has been found out, and I must warn you fairly that a reckoning is due. Digging again and coming upon more poor, starving pets, was the ironic reply. It was evident that the youth meant to show bravado to the last. No, Willett slowly rejoined. At this time I did not have to dig. We have had men look up Dr. Allen, and they found the false beard and spectacles in the bungalow. Excellent, commented the disquieted host in an effort to be wittily insulting. And I trust they proved more becoming than the beard and glasses you have now on. They would become you very well, came an even and studied response, as indeed they seem to have done. As Willett said this, it almost seemed as though a cloud passed over the sun, though there was no change in the shadow on the floor. Then Ward ventured, And is this what asks so hotly for reckoning? Suppose a man does find it, and then useful to be twofold. No, said Willett gravely. Again you are wrong. It is no business of mine if any man seeks duality, provided he has any right to exist at all, and provided he does not destroy what called him out of space. Ward now started violently. Well, sir, what have ye found, and what do you want with me? The doctor let a little time elapse before replying, as if choosing his words for an effective answer. I have found, he finally intoned, something in a cupboard behind ancient overmantel where the picture once was, and I burned it and buried the ashes where the grave of Charles Dexter Ward ought to be. The madman choked and sprang from the chair in which he had been sitting. Damn ye, who'd ye tell? And who will believe it when he was after these full 2 months with me alive? What do you mean to do? Willett, though a small man, actually took on a kind of judicial majesty as he calmed the patient with a gesture. I have told no one. This is no common case. It is a madness out of time and a horror from beyond the spheres which no police or lawyers or courts or alienists could ever fathom or grapple with. Thank God some chance has left inside me the spark of imagination, that I might not go astray in thinking out this thing. You cannot deceive me, Joseph Kerwin, for I know that your accursed magic is true. I know how you wove the spell that brooded outside the years and fastened on your double and descendant. I know how you drew him into the past and got him to raise you up from your detestable grave. I know how he kept you hidden in his laboratory while you studied modern things and roved abroad as a vampire by night, and how you later showed yourself in beard and glasses that no one might wonder at your godless likeness to him. I know what you resolved to do, and when he bulked at your monstrous riflings of the world's tombs, and at what you planned afterward, and I know how you did it. You left off your beard and glasses and fooled the guards around the house. They thought it was he who went in, and they thought it was he who came out when you had strangled and hidden him. But you hadn't reckoned on the different contacts of two minds. You were a fool, Kerwin, to fancy that a mere visual identity would be enough. Why didn't you think of the speech and the voice and the handwriting? It hasn't worked, you see, after all. You know better than I who wrote that message in minuscule, but I will warn you that it was not written in vain. There are abominations and blasphemies which must be stamped out, and I believe the writer of those words will attend to Orne and Hutchinson. One of those creatures wrote you once, do not call upon any that you cannot put down. You were undone once before, perhaps in that very way. And it may be your own evil magic will undo you all again. Kerwin, a man can't tamper with nature beyond certain limits, and every horror you have woven will rise up to wipe you out. But here the doctor was cut short by a convulsive cry from the creature before him. Hopelessly at bay, weaponless, and knowing that any show of physical violence would bring a score of attendants to the doctor's rescue, Joseph Kerwin had recourse to his one ancient ally and began a series of cabalistic motions with his forefingers as his deep, hollow voice, now unconcealed by feigned hoarseness, bellowed out the opening words of a terrible formula. Her Adonai Elohim, Adonai Jehovah, Adonai Sabaoth, Metraton. But Willett was too quick for him. Even as the dogs in the yard outside began to howl, and even as the chill wind sprang suddenly up from that bay, the doctor commenced the solemn and measured intonation of that which he had meant all along to recite, an eye for an eye, magic for magic. Let the outcome show how well the lesson of the abyss had been learned. So in a clear voice, Marinus Bicknell Willett began the second of the pair of formulae, whose first had raised the writer of those minuscules, the cryptic invocation whose heading was the dragon's tail, a sign of the descending node. Ogthrod, Eif, Gebli, Yog-Sothoth, Nagayai, Zro. At the very first word from Willett's mouth, the previously commenced formula of the patient stopped short. Unable to speak, the monster made wild motions with his arms until they were too rested. When the awful name of Yog-Sothoth was uttered, the hideous change began. It was not merely a dissolution, but rather a transformation or recapitulation, and Willett shut his eyes lest he faint before the rest of the incantation could be pronounced. But he did not faint, and that man of unholy centuries and forbidden secrets never troubled the world again. The madness out of time had subsided, and the case of Charles Dexter Ward was closed. Opening his eyes before staggering out of that room of horror, Dr. Willett saw that what he had kept in memory had not been kept amiss. There had, as he had predicted, been no need for acids. For like his accursed picture a year before, Joseph Kerwin now lay scattered on the floor as a thin coating of fine bluish gray. Yeah, that was the end of the case of Charles Dexter Ward. That was a ride. There was a lot of different stuff that happened. There was a whole lot of very highly descriptive text and other things, but we did it. We made it through the best of H.P. Lovecraft, guys. So thank you once again for coming with me through this journey. I will find other spooky stories. Maybe I'll find some of Edgar Allan Poe's more famous like poems and things. I've just got to try to find something that's kind of short-ish because otherwise I'll have to keep splitting things up or they'll be like hours long. But yeah, thank you so much, guys, for being here for today's spooky story, and I will